Hello, YouTube. I'm responding to a video posted on That Guy T's channel called Questions Libertarians Have for Statists. Now, I don't know if I really qualify as a statist in terms of what people in this video mean by it, but since I do support the existence of some form of state, I am technically a statist. So, let's get into it.
Hey statists, we've got some questions for you. If a kid couldn't afford lunch because the school bullies kept taking a percentage of his allowance, you wouldn't blame the kid's parents for not giving him enough. So why is it that when people struggle financially, you blame the employer who provides them with money and not the government which is taxing them?
I don't necessarily blame the employer nor the government. The reasons people don't have money are complex and depend on the individual situation. Usually it comes down to some lack of something in the person, bad luck, poor decisions, or some combination of all of those.
For fans of democracy, I would ask, is it okay to forcibly rob, control, or otherwise victimize somebody as long as the majority approves of it?
Sometimes. If robbing one person helps hundreds of other people, for example, then from the perspective of running a state, it could be justified. That being said, I think people should be robbed, controlled, or victimized as little as possible, and ideally not at all.
We all know that every economic system has market failures. Capitalism, socialism, communism, whatever. But my question is, why do you feel morally justified in forcing other people to subsidize these failures? Why should I be forced to subsidize failed electric car companies like Fisker or failed government initiatives like Obamacare? Shouldn't I have the right to decide what risk I want to take with my own money?
I think you should be able to opt out of your societal obligations and in exchange receive no societal benefits. I would support the creation of for something like anarchy zones, where people could live if they wanted to opt out of society, or some similar idea to that.
How come you want to ban things that you don't like? As long as they're not hurting other people, what's the big deal?
I don't want to ban anything that isn't hurting anyone else. I think you've confused being in support of some form of state with being an SJW.
Statists of the left who are always talking about how government's going to help the poor and demarginalize marginalized groups. I don't understand this. From the ancient world through the Middle Ages all the way up to modern times, governments have largely conspired against the poor. I'm thinking in particular a century ago with eugenics programs and segregation programs and zoning programs, business regulation and union rules. Everything was designed to exclude, marginalize, and impoverish groups that didn't have power. Governments are always controlled by rich people. That's just the way it works. Why do you think the government is the right means to help the poor? It makes no sense to me.
I think governments are usually designed by the rich for the rich. In the form of government I support, the state would not be involved in societal control. I think charities created by individuals should be responsible for helping the disadvantaged, and the government should really have no part in it.
So I punched this comic face in and said, "How do you like those marks?" Oh, we're recording? Does my hair look okay? How can you claim on one hand to be anti-guns, yet on the other hand, you want the state to take guns away at gunpoint? Pew pew.
I think you've confused being in support of some form of state with being anti-gun. I do not support people's guns being taken away at gunpoint.
Government has slaughtered 250 million of its own people in acts of democide. How can you trust such a beast to rule over you? And as some of you argue for, to be disarmed to.
Government is not a homogeneous entity. Some governments are worse than others. None would be perfect, but not all systems of government are equally bad. I think you need to watch a little bit less X-Files.
Why is it that no matter how much money the government takes from its citizens, it's always broke?
Governments tend to spend whatever money they gain from taxation, and since they tend to be huge, bloated organizations, much of that money is lost to waste or corruption. Despite that, government claims of being broke are usually just excuses to raise taxes rather than being an actual reflection of reality.
If keeping 100% of someone else's income is slavery,
then at what percentage is it no longer slavery?
Well, this really sounds like a semantics question, but I don't think the definition of slavery is entirely dependent on how much of someone's money you keep. If, for example, a parent keeps all the money their kid makes and invests it for them, is that child their parent's slave? No, certainly not. I feel like this question is meant to be sort of a gotcha to say that everyone who pays taxes is a slave, but I'm not seeing it.
Can a bunch of people who don't have the right to do a certain thing grant to somebody else the right to do it? And if not, how did Congress acquire the right to do things that you and I don't have the right to do?
Well, a bunch of people got together before any of us were born and decided that they together have certain abilities and rights that anyone else alone does not have. If you don't approve of this, you should have the ability to opt out of society, or you can work to change what you don't like through the mechanisms in place to make that change.
Why are you comfortable spending borrowed money knowing your children will have to pay it off down the line? You're increasing their eventual taxes before they can even vote. Isn't that the definition of taxation without representation?
Well, in the current system, I have no say in how governments spend money, and I certainly don't approve of many government spending decisions. This is one of the reasons I oppose the current system of government, actually.
If people are so f***ing greedy and selfish that we need governments to steal from the rich and give to the poor and needy, then why do over 1.5 million charities exist globally, with $373 billion dollars being raised in 2015 alone? And that's not including the Clinton Foundation's money laundering operation. Alleged money laundering operation.
I agree, it makes no sense, which is why I propose governments should not be in the charity business. The reason they currently are is that there are no rules preventing them from doing so, and people in power will always want to use that power to control other people.
You do realize that making something illegal won't make it go away. Guns, drugs, the black market will provide.
Making something illegal is certainly not a foolproof way of getting rid of something, but you're discounting the fact that many people choose to obey most laws for a variety of reasons. Basically, laws are a deterrent. That they're not always 100% effective is not a good argument against their existence.
Here's some of the money government wasted. The government spent $1.4 million on an app that just simply points left and right for the TSA. That should have been done for way cheaper. Oh, that's not crazy enough for you? How about this? The government wasted $1.4 trillion on a jet that doesn't even work. That's enough to buy every homeless person in the United States a mansion. A $600,000 home. Oh, that's not crazy enough for you. The government lost $6 trillion. Knowing all of this, do you still think the government can spend your money more wisely than you can?
I wouldn't trust the current government in America, I assume, to buy me a toothbrush. Again, though, not all states are the same.
How can you rationalize basic philosophical concepts such as the non-aggression principle as being quote-unquote too difficult for society to be educated on and abide by, yet believe that hundreds of thousands of pages of federal and state regulations, clauses, case files, and amendments are somehow easier?
I don't think the non-aggression principle is too complicated for people to understand. I do think federal law is too complicated for most people to understand.
Is it illegal for me to import my hedgehogs to a multitude of places, but it's totally legal to import thousands upon thousands of fighting-age economic migrants?
I have no idea what the logic is behind animal import laws. I do think you're trying to equate two very different things with your question, though.
If it's wrong for you to do a certain thing, can you, by voting, make it right for someone else to do the exact same thing?
Yes, because I see a difference between morality when acting as an individual and when acting on behalf of the state. It is wrong for me to kill someone, but it is sometimes justified for a state to kill someone, say, a known terrorist planning to commit an act of terrorism.
If the competitive market ingenuity of capitalism can deliver us things like iPhones, 3D printers, and private spaceships, why should services as important as justice, roads, and defense be monopolized by the state?
Because innovation is not the most important factor in those things. We don't need better roads as much as we need working roads. Leaving things we rely on to the market will always result in some people not getting that thing because they don't have a big enough market share. Essentially, if road building were left up to the market, many poor areas would have no roads.
Left-wing statists. When you're opposing gun laws, you argue the government shouldn't be so powerful that it can disarm the populace. So why, when it comes to drug laws, do you argue the government should be so powerful that it can tell people what they can put into their own bodies?
I don't think the government should be able to tell people what they can and can't do as long as it's not harming anyone else. However, if, for example, a certain drug causes you to act in a violent and uncontrolled manner, it's perfectly reasonable for the government to make that drug illegal and try to prevent people from taking it.
Now, to statists of the right, claim you're opposed to socialism and don't see government as the answer, and yet invariably you're celebrating the cops, the first responders, and the fire departments, and the jails, war, all big public sector programs. It's a kind of the socialism that you love. Why do you think that that's going to work better than the private sector?
The answer to that is complex, but basically, I only want government to have control over things in which a profit motive would consistently clash with what is best for the population at large. Corporations and market forces will inevitably do what's best for profits for shareholders, not what's best for the people. Sometimes those things match up nicely. When they don't, some form of government intervention is necessary. Now, that doesn't mean that private companies couldn't supply things like police forces, but there would need to be significant government oversight or regulation for it to work effectively, in my opinion.
If people are innately good, what is the need for government? And if people are innately evil, what is to stop them using government to cause evil to one another? And would it not be better that their influence be limited to that which they can achieve voluntarily, rather than to give them the added benefit of legitimised force?
People are neither innately good or innately evil. If people were innately good, there would be no need for any form of government, and if they were innately evil, there would be no point in anything.
A major question that I have for proponents of state economic regulations in particular is how exactly can you sleep at night knowing the economic destruction that you have created? The effect of government regulations on output has been calculated to have an accumulated reduction cost on the American GDP of nearly $40 trillion just since 1949. In other words, absent of any federal economic regulations, after World War II, we could have tripled our GDP. Every citizen could have an average income of $333,000 instead of $53,000, a $277,000 increase in the average income. This doesn't even factor in the cost of compliance, rent-seeking, and state-level regulations. We could have had so much more prosperity and so much less poverty without state regulations on our economy. So how can you look your opponents in the eye and claim that your regulations are somehow for the common man?
Those numbers seem like a gross oversimplification of the situation. What percent of that increase would have gone into the overseas bank accounts of the super rich? And what proof do you have that income would have actually increased in real-world dollars rather than just profits increasing? That being said, I sleep quite well at night because I haven't put into place any regulations and I don't support the current oligarchic system of government.
Left-wing statists. When you're opposing drug laws, especially weed, you argue the government shouldn't be so powerful that it can tell people what they can and can't put into their own bodies. So why, when it comes to gun laws, do you think the government should be so powerful that it can have a complete monopoly over effective force?
I will answer your question with a question. Why do you assume that someone can't oppose both drug and gun regulation and yet still be in support of some form of state?
Here are the things you can't do without government permission. Build a house, drive a car, own a gun, go fishing, collect rainwater, hunt, cross the road, get married, leave the country, start a business, fly on a commercial plane, take drugs, work. It's actually hard to think of something that doesn't require government permission. Knowing this, how can you say you're free?
I don't think I'm absolutely free. I've accepted a certain limitation on my freedom in exchange for certain benefits, such as safety. That doesn't mean I agree with all the limitations placed on my freedom, though.
If being a democratically elected constitutional republic creates legitimate political authority, does that mean that all the things that were done by the democratically elected constitutional republics of the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and North Korea, all those things were legitimate and justified?
If the rules of Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany fully allowed the actions of those states, then those were not good systems that I would ever support. Not all systems are created equal, though. The laws and rules of a state like America would not allow any government to legitimately massacre all the Jews, for example.
If you're a proud, government-loving liberal who champions personal choice, could you please explain why I can't choose to not fund the murder of innocent children abroad?
I think you should be able to opt out of society.
If you've ever said there ought to be a law, or if you believe that government is the best solution to most of life's problems, I have one question for you. Are you prepared to kill? Every law, no matter how big or small it appears to be, is backed by violent force, and in many cases, death.
Well, I don't think the government is the solution to most of life's problems, but I'll answer your questions anyways. Yes, I am prepared to kill if the issue is important enough. And by that I mean, if I kill you, other lives will be saved or a lot of harm will be prevented. That being said, killing should be avoided unless there are no other alternatives. Specific to this issue, I think law enforcement officers should be trained to avoid killing except in the most extreme situations and prosecuted when they used lethal force without proving that non-lethal force was impossible and the person was a direct threat to others.
You really want the same people who run the DMV to be in charge of your health care?
Well, no, I would hope doctors would be in charge of my healthcare. I think you mean organizing my healthcare. And while there are many problems with the DMV, at the end of the day, most people who want driver's licenses manage to get them. That's the bare minimum standard I would want with healthcare.
Why is it that you prefer anti-discrimination laws which force those who hate other races to hide that prejudice and make money off of those other races, to a system where they could be open about said prejudice and lose money?
I strongly oppose laws of that sort for that very reason.
You guys often say that libertarians have too much faith in the goodness of people. Why then do you, in the same breath, argue that I give up my right to bear arms and entrust my personal safety to police in gun-free zones? That seems like pretty strong faith in human nature to me.
That's a very good argument, T. I agree with it.
Statists, since the war on drugs has been an absolute failure, what makes you think a war on guns would be any different?
I think you're confusing people who think there should be a state with people who want to repeal the Second Amendment and take away everyone's guns. While in the Venn diagram of political beliefs, there may be some overlap between those two groups, they are not the same group.
Can you morally justify the federal government preventing a small territory from seceding from a larger country?
It depends. If the small territory is completely surrounded by the larger country, then that small territory is technically relying on the larger country for protection and defense, and will be interconnected with the larger country in many ways. Is the small territory going to pay the larger country for the luxury of living without any fear of invasion? Can anyone who wants to travel into and stay in the small territory or leave the small territory? Are there going to be borders, and who's going to pay for those borders? There are likely many, many more questions that would need to be answered. And if they aren't answered well, then the larger country is, in my opinion, justified in not allowing the small territory to secede.
How is me writing down I'm in charge and then getting 20 friends to sign it any different from the drafting of the Constitution?
Do you and your 20 friends have significant amounts of power, money, and support? If not, that would be one significant difference.
If roads are so complicated and magical that they can only be built by governments, then why do they hire private companies to actually build the eh? My fucking roads!
I believe the main arguments for governments building roads is that otherwise poor people would have to manage without roads because they wouldn't be able to afford it themselves. Anyone who's arguing that roads are too complicated and thus must be made by the government is probably an idiot.
Why is every logical explanation we provide about how something will work just pure speculation, while any doomsday scenario you pull out of your ass about anarchism is absolute truth?
I don't know how to answer such a vague leading question. I can only say I have never done this to my knowledge.
How highly do you think of yourself that you think it's your right to impose your views on people you've never met and tell them it's good for them?
I think quite highly of myself, thank you, but sadly I'm not a dictator, nor do I expect any opportunity to become a dictator, fingers crossed. I support a system in which many people select a small number of well-informed, qualified people to decide what's best for everyone on certain issues. Not on all issues, though.
Listen to this ridiculousness. We protect our president with guns, but our children with paper gun-free zone signs. Congress has a 9% approval rating. Government can't even balance a budget. We are about to reach a $20 trillion debt. Social Security and Medicare and other socialist policies are unsustainable. The drug war kills more people than drugs itself. How can you say government is effective?
The current system is highly ineffective for many of the reasons you listed. The current system being broken is not an effective argument for there being no system at all.
Now, to the statists of the left and right, who are constantly against free trade and promoting protectionism and warlike foreign trade policies, why is it that you think trade between nation states is any different from trade between states in the U.S., between Vermont and New Hampshire or Georgia and Mississippi, which we understand is a good thing because it broadens the division of labor and makes everybody better off? Why do you not see that that's also true internationally? And why do you think a solution to this non-problem is to raise taxes on the American people?
I'm not an economist, but I don't actually think free trade between the states is a good thing any more than I think free trade between countries is a good thing. While free trade divides labor nicely, I think it also concentrates wealth, which I think is a bad thing.
An individual's moral conscience conflicts with the commands and rules of lawmakers and law enforcers. Is an individual morally obligated to do what they believe to be wrong simply to obey the law?
Good question. I think an example would really help, because I'm having trouble thinking of a reasonable one. In general, I think one of the consequences of law is that sometimes people get arrested for following their conscience, like Socrates. In an ideal society, this would happen as little as possible, but as far as I can see, it's simply a consequence of having laws and punishment for breaking those laws.
You keep saying I have to be moral by voting for a lesser evil this year. Could you please explain how any kind of evil is ever moral?
I don't believe in voting for a lesser evil. I don't think that makes sense.
Given my first question to right-wingers and my second to left-wingers, comparing drug rights, which half of you advocate, and gun rights, which the other half of you advocate, it seems to me that there are two possible compromises. Either we go full authoritarian and none of you get what you want, or we go full libertarian and you can both have what you want. Which sounds more appealing to you? And given that answer that you gave, don't you think there are one or two other issues we could apply this reasoning to?
Yes, I actually think there are many instances in which libertarian thinking is the best way to go. So that's the last question. I think overall, there seems to be some confusion about what a statist actually is, and I wonder if maybe these questions aren't directed at some sort of straw man, because a lot of them seem to be directed at people who want to control other people. Like this seems like more like questions for authoritarians, perhaps. So I think a definition of what a statist is would have been helpful at the start of this. But yeah, overall, I think a lot of libertarian ideas make a lot of sense. I think the government should have a lot less power and control than it currently does, and it should have its fingers in a lot less pies. I think that would help. I think a decentralized government would be a good idea. I'll probably make more videos in the future about what I think my ideal form of government would be. But for now, that's everything I have to say. Thank you for listening, and I wish you all the best.